Good evening, everyone. Good evening, everyone. Hi, my name is Elisa Gilbert. I'm the Director of Innovation at the Grantham Institute for Climate Change and the Environment here. And it's my great pleasure to welcome you all to the Grantham Annual Lecture 2024. So welcome. A few bits of housekeeping before we start. We decided not to plan any fire alarms during the lecture. So if you do hear a fire alarm, please exit through the fire escapes that you can see there and just exit the building completely. I don't know where the muster point is, but just leave the building. If you can please make sure that your mobile phones are off, etc. Oh no, don't turn them off. We are going to be asking some questions during the evening on Menti, which will come up there, and we'll be collecting all of those messages, those questions and sorting them out. So keep your phone on silent, but do log in to menti.com and we'll provide the scanning code later on for you to log in there. But I am going to introduce you to our chair of the Grantham Institute, Professor Sir Brian Hoskins, who's going to take you through the evening. So thank you very much, Brian.
Well, first I'd like to add my welcome to you all, both in the hall and online. So I'm going to give a few words about the Grantham Institute and just a couple about me, how I happen to be here. Before I then get on to the main business of the evening. So I'm chair of the Grantham Institute, but most of my career has actually been trying to understand how the atmosphere works in weather and climate. But I gave my first talk on climate change in public talk in 1975, nearly 50 years ago, so I've been very unsuccessful. But I've always been interested in them and quite involved in it. And the Grantham Institute was very much in the line when I was asked would I be its first director, and that seemed a major opportunity given all the expertise at Imperial College that is relevant to climate change. And the Grantham Institute, now Climate Change and the Environment, does all the sort of things you'd expect at Imperial: education and training, research, innovation, and but it also does policy, and that is not so usual at Imperial. At least it wasn't when we started. And it tries to inform at every level of society and stimulate activity. And tonight's event is very much in that line. So the running order of the evening: we'll have our keynote lecture, and then there'll be a panel discussion. And at any stage, I'm told there'll be a live Q&A. Anyone can submit questions for the panel online via Mentimeter, and the details on the screen. Hint. Okay. After that, there will be a networking reception with refreshments and opportunities to talk to one another, and please do come to that. So now to the main business, introduction for Caroline Lucas. Being an academic institution, I thought we should mention first that she has a PhD in English and obtained that in 1990. But rather before that, she was inspired by reading a book by Jonathan Porritt to join the Green Party, and she's been active in it ever since and at all levels of the party. That she was then elected, started putting her name forward, elected to Oxfordshire County Council, a member of European Parliament, and then in 2010 to be the Green Party's first ever MP representing Brighton Pavilion. And she was that MP until this year. She is respected as an MP and in all her activities for her passionate views, her hard work, and her integrity. 3 times the Observer readers, for instance, have voted her Politician of the Year. She's written a number of books, but in April this year, she produced her latest book, Another England, and the subtitle is How to Reclaim Our National Story. I am absolutely delighted then to ask Caroline Lucas to give the 2024 Grantham Annual Lecture.
Thank you, Brian, for such a kind introduction. You very kindly didn't mention that my PhD is in 16th century literary romance. So I was very relieved, as you can imagine, when I was told that I didn't need to know lots about scientific formulas before I was accepting this invitation to speak here tonight. But I am genuinely both honoured and hugely grateful to have this opportunity with the Grantham Institute, and to be honest, just a little daunted as well, given the illustriousness of those in whose footsteps I am following. So thank you, Grantham Institute, for your kind invitation. Thanks to all of you for joining tonight. We meet at a time of unprecedented climate alarm. Just a few weeks ago, climate scientists concluded that the record emissions and temperatures mean that, in their words, the future of humanity hangs in the balance, with the majority of the Earth's vital signs worse than ever recorded, indicating, in their words again, a critical and unpredictable new phase of the climate crisis. And the evidence of that escalating instability is, of course, all around us. Summer 2024 was the Earth's hottest season on record, bringing with it a deluge of extreme weather, increasingly unbearable heat, catastrophic cyclones and floods, and 2 extreme hurricanes in the space of 2 weeks. Lives and livelihoods lost, crops devastated, homes and businesses washed away, and the highest price paid, as always, by the world's poorest and most marginal communities, especially women and girls who are least responsible and often least equipped to respond. And all while we continue to burn fossil fuels at such an alarming rate that in just 5 short years, we will have consumed the entire remaining global carbon budget, the maximum amount of climate gases the Earth's atmosphere can take, if we're to have a fighting chance of staying within or returning to the 1.5 global heating limit. Last week, the UN Emission Gap Report highlighted what it calls the massive gap between rhetoric and reality, with a quantum leap in ambition required to get back on track to deliver the Paris goals. And just today, the UNFCCC Executive Secretary was quoted as saying that even if every country delivered on their current emission reduction plans, a highly unlikely scenario, even if they did actually deliver on them, they would still fall so far short of what's needed that we would essentially be guaranteeing what he called a human and economic train wreck for every country without exception. But the dangers that we face aren't just from rising temperatures, because the threat of the illiberal, anti-democratic right is rising too. Democracy, like the climate, is under assault all around the world, with the toxic combination of dark money, voter suppression, and state violence bolstering polluters and autocrats at the very same time as stifling majority opinion and undermining social movements. Some of the worst laggards on climate action, of course, are countries where authoritarianism is either entrenched or on the rise. Think of China, Russia, Saudi Arabia, India, among many others. Closer to home, by my last count, far-right parties have now entered government in 7 European democracies, and in several more, including France, they're already at the gates. Former fascists are reappearing from the shadows. New right-wing populist parties are emerging, and a number of existing conservative parties, including some alarmingly close to home, are being taken over. And without exception, where governments turn further to the right, they shut down policies designed to limit climate breakdown. And so the truth is that these 2 forces, the rise of populism and the acceleration of the nature and climate emergencies, are becoming increasingly interlinked. Climate has become the new front line in culture wars, not just in the UK, but right across the world, with the extreme right ready to exploit any and every opportunity to sow discourse. Weaponizing climate action has now become a major feature of their playbook, from Paris to Perugia, from New York to New Delhi. And at the same time, planetary collapse creates exactly the conditions in which the politics of populism thrives: the chaos, the fear, and the division. Now, it can sometimes feel like an overwhelming task to have to try to tackle both of these threats at the same time, to have to fight on both of these fronts simultaneously. And some might reasonably ask whether it isn't a distraction from addressing the existential dangers posed by the climate emergency to be worrying about putting out the fires of populism at the same time. But the case I want to make tonight is that tackling climate breakdown and challenging populism are the same battle. That bold climate action is itself one of the best ways to neutralize the populist threat and to expose its fallacies and flaws. My argument is that if it's to be successful and sustainable, climate action requires precisely the nationwide investment, the democratic renewal, the community resilience, and the active hope, which are also the strongest antidotes to the economic hardship, insecurity, and inequality that drive the search for the simplistic answers and the scapegoating of others, which fuel the populist right. Now, I'll say a little bit more about those 4 responses in a moment, but first, just a few more words on the rise of populism, because whichever form they take and wherever they appear, populist forces are systematically exploiting the failings of the neoliberal establishment and its divisive economic orthodoxies. But if economic hardship is the starting point, national populism typically moves on remarkably swiftly to issues of culture and identity. Indeed, it has devised a whole new lexicon to describe how the luxury beliefs and virtue signaling of the new elite, combined with a woke establishment, are frustrating the will of the people. And it is here that climate policies take center stage. You know, who could have imagined that low-traffic neighborhoods and 15-minute cities would become such frenzied ideological battlegrounds, or that the humble heat pump would become the focus of so many myths and misinformation, or that boiler wars would be so fiercely contested. Yet all of these are on the front line of ever more vicious culture wars. Now, all wars have to be funded by someone somewhere, and this one can all too often be tracked back to the ultra-wealthy who consider any kinds of constraints and regulation as a threat to their economic interests, and who see hard-right and far-right politics as their defense. And these individuals and the corporations and media outlets that they control and wield are intent on systematically shutting down the remaining options for climate action commensurate with the climate science. Social media, of course, is an increasingly fertile battleground where the economically beleaguered and culturally dispossessed can so easily be reached with the myths and misinformation about the costs and consequences of climate policies. I was reminded of this just a few weeks ago when I dared to post on X about the closure of the UK's last coal-fired power station. It was, I thought, a considered post that thanked all those who had worked so hard to power our past and that called for a fair and just transition. You are insane. The fallacy of the climate scam will be the demise of this nation. You abject effing lunatics will be the death of this country. Utter bollocks, insidious hoax. We all know the so-called climate crisis is a money-making scam, were among the less offensive remarks that I saw. The same spirit, if in somewhat less embellished language, informed much of the last government's public statements on the issue. Rishi Sunak famously abandoned key green pledges, claiming that they would impose unacceptable costs on hard-working British families. While the favourite to be the next Conservative Party leader, Kemi Badenoch, talks of delaying the net zero target by decades, warning that climate policies could bankrupt the country. And not to be outdone, her Tory rival, Robert Jenrick, last week said he wanted to repeal the Climate Change Act completely, in its entirety, in order to remove what he called its Soviet-style carbon budgets. You know, those ways of measuring that the UK is actually on track to meet its legal emission reduction targets. And the prospect of an even closer alignment between an increasingly hard-right Tory party and Reform UK is also deeply worrying. Much of Reform UK's general election manifesto was devoted to attacking net zero and includes a near complete set of what Professor Catherine Hayhoe has called the 5 flavours of climate denial. To remind you, 1, it's not real, 2, it's not us, 3, it's not bad, 4, we can't fix it, and 5, hey, it's too late. So, the particular resonance of climate as a populist target is, I think, important to explore a little further if we're going to be able to counter it effectively. And I am grateful to Professor Jonathan White at the LSE Grantham Institute, whose paper, What Makes Climate a Populist Issue, of last year, helpfully unpacks some of the issues. And in that paper, he singles out the promise of political agency, though not unique to populism, as a key part of its ideological appeal. The framing of the climate crisis as an emergency that makes it necessary to act in certain ways creates opportunities for populist critics to define themselves, by contrast, as champions of free choice, refusing to have their actions dictated by external forces. So to the extent that climate change is approached with a technocratic emphasis on deadlines and functional adaptations to necessity, he argues, it provides even more fertile territory for populism. But of course, it doesn't have to be that way. As White points out, there is nothing inherently technocratic about climate change as a topic. By deliberately pluralizing green thought and widening participation in defining its ends and means, we can strengthen the sense of agency that's attached to it. And by setting out more compelling and transformative visions of positive change, we can offer alternative promises of agency. So what are the implications of White's analysis going forward? Well, I think they point to the importance of precisely those 4 approaches that I referenced earlier: the nationwide investment, the democratic renewal, the community resilience, and the active hope, which I'm arguing are essential both for effective policy making on climate and on combating populism. So first, on investment, I think it's clear that we need to fully invest in the green transition, a massive injection of funds into a UK counterpart to the Inflation Reduction Act in the US, bringing jobs in every constituency, substantial skills and training, and well-funded apprenticeship programs. We know that Britain is a place of grotesque inequalities, not just between classes, but geographically, between regions, yes, between north and south, but also between thriving cities and failing towns within the same region. And the economic injustice that people are experiencing is accompanied by acute insecurity. Those who have historically been held back must not face a future of more of the same. And breaking that cycle is essential if we're to break the connection between perceived climate policies and the rise of populism. And it seems to me that many politicians learned exactly the wrong lessons from the Uxbridge and South Ruislip by-election and the toxic myths and misinformation that circulated around the costs of the ultra-low emission zone. Because the answer isn't to throw climate policies onto the scrap heap for fear that they might not be popular. The answer is to ensure that climate policies genuinely do make bills cheaper, travel easier, homes more comfortable to live in, and create the skilled and stable green jobs in the process. That people's lives really do get better, that those with the broadest shoulders bear the greatest costs, to demonstrate that we really are genuinely all in this together. Because unless we can show beyond doubt that those on the lowest incomes will not be harmed in the transition, we not only reinforce inequality, but we also give ammunition to the populist right, who are no doubt honing their new snake-oiled slogans even as we speak. It's not enough to say the majority will be better off or the majority won't lose out. We have to be certain that no one on lower incomes loses out, period. So that means more money for scrappage schemes, for example, more money for boiler replacements, more money for government-sponsored retraining and reskilling. Because if we give even an inch to the argument that climate policies are paid for off the backs of the poor, we not only do an injustice, but we hand a victory to those seeking to foment unrest with stories of injustice and unfairness. And as we know to our cost, the extreme right excel at those very stories. And that's why I believe it actually does really matter that Labour abandons its 28 billion promise of annual green investment, and why we have to make a powerful case for its reinstatement. Not only because that investment could have enabled the rollout of a comprehensive home energy efficiency programme, for example, absolutely targeting those who live in the coldest and leakiest properties and improving their lives, but also because the signal which its cancellation gave out will not have been missed by those forces determined to exploit the climate crisis and to create a misleading narrative around climate affordability in order to derail not just a just transition, but any kind of transition at all. So a transformative Green New Deal of the kind that many of us have been arguing for over a decade would focus investment on those areas and those communities that have been failed the most. And it would get away from a narrow obsession with economic growth as the be-all and end-all of government's policy and replace it with restoring nature, reducing inequality, and promoting health and well-being. And on the subject of investment, climate justice has to be at the heart of the global negotiations at COP29 as well, of course. And the same arguments apply. The UK is one of the richest economies in the world. We have a moral responsibility to go further and faster in cutting our own emissions than the majority of others because our historic cumulative emissions are so much higher and our capacity so much greater. The truth is that net zero by 2050 is nowhere near ambitious enough for wealthier countries. And we also have a responsibility to provide significantly greater funding to support those nations already suffering the worst impacts. The previous government pledges on international climate finance were woefully insufficient, and they were drawn from an already inadequate and depleted aid budget. Climate justice demands that significantly more money must be on the table, domestically and at COP29, because it is always the poorest who lose the most with every fraction of a degree that our planet heats up. So second, democratic renewal. The evidence suggests as a general rule that those territories with the healthiest democracies, those least in hock to vested interests, are making the most progress on addressing the climate emergency. Now, some may be tempted to conclude that given the urgent need for action, we don't have time for the messiness of the democratic process, the elections, the lobbying, the compromises, and that we might just have to put up with some autocrats instead who could unilaterally make the hard decisions and speed up the process. But as US climate campaigner Bill McKibben has pointed out, that is wrong for both moral and practical reasons. First, because autocrats who can act instantly on the climate crisis can also act instantly on any number of other things, as the people of Xinjiang and Tibet would testify were they allowed to do so. And second, because autocrats are often themselves made by fossil fuel interests. In other words, since oil and gas are concentrated in a few spots around the world, the people who live on top of them, or who control them, end up with huge amounts of unaccountable power. Look no further than Vladimir Putin, whose power is almost entirely built on fossil fuels. Contrast that to the decentralized, diffuse character of renewable energies, which, by their very nature, are more amenable to democratic control. So that means that part of our strategy as climate campaigners has to be to work for functioning democratic states, not just to uphold existing democratic processes, but to widen and deepen them too, and to innovate with more flexible and inclusive models of engagement. Professor White's warning that populism thrives when it can feed off people's real or perceived lack of agency means we have to work harder than ever to ensure climate solutions are co-created, done with people, not to them. And there are plenty of inspiring examples. I was a co-chair of the IPPR's 2-year-long Environmental Justice Commission, and we set up some genuinely representative citizens' juries who deliberated over months on the best way to tackle the climate and nature emergencies. And the ideas and proposals that came out of those processes were, without exception, far bolder and far more ambitious than any government is suggesting. From proportional voting systems and citizens' assemblies to giving people greater agency over changes that affect them, to new digital laws that crack down on fake news and post-truth advertising, and an education system that grows critical thinkers on climate resilience, and radical devolution to local authorities and to local regions. there is a whole wealth of ways in which we can actively defend and renew our democracy, working with citizens so that the change process better reflects all of our voices. And I was particularly struck by proposals on democratic renewal and community resilience, which were made in a joint letter to The Guardian just recently from a range of organisations, including Demos, Oxfam, Citizens UK, the New Citizen Project, about the outbreak of community spirit that we witnessed in the wake of this summer's racist riots and on the need for a shared response to them. If we're serious about mission-based government and a more collaborative democracy, they write, it's going to require a national effort. And the response last week was an example of that, but it could go further. And they proposed that the government should launch what they called a Build Back Stronger inquiry on the ways that it can further enable society-side partnership to collaboratively rebuild communities, not just drawing from the great and the good, but absolutely including the citizens who have already shown such leadership. And as they conclude, crises can bring people and institutions together in ways that felt unimaginable before. We saw it during COVID, but then they dissipate. We shouldn't let that happen this time around. To which I say, absolutely, 100%. And I believe we also need to get better at telling positive stories about the human capacity for cooperation and collaboration as well. You know, for far too long, the dominant story promoted by too many politicians and economists has been the neoliberal narrative that we're all out for ourselves, that we're innately greedy and competitive, that a vicious ideology of extreme individualism that pits us against each other is somehow the natural order of things. But as more recent evidence from psychology, anthropology, neuroscience, and evolutionary biology mounts up, a very different story emerges. And it turns out that we possess an astonishing degree of altruism and a unique level of concern about others' welfare. That in fact we are the supreme cooperators, an urge that is hardwired into our brains through natural selection. We have in many ways literally forgotten who we are, and that is where the arts can help us. Because it is the arts that speak to hearts as well as minds, moving us to reimagine our world and inspiring communities to take climate action. It is culture who defines who we are, what we treasure, how we live. It helps us to connect with our own creativity, to regain that sense of agency, and turn into active creators, shaping our material and conceptual worlds. And that takes me to my third point, community resilience. And one way we could build that resilience is through foregrounding the potentially groundbreaking role that climate adaptation can play. While high-level efforts towards climate mitigation can sometimes seem diffuse and remote, adaptation, by definition, is more focused, more local, more tangible. It has the capacity to transform climate concern from the status of an abstract belief to a lived reality, something we do every day together. And in so doing, it builds agency, dismantling the view that we are powerless in the face of the vastness of climate breakdown. And it gives choice back to local communities. Now, we know that over the past 14 years, climate adaptation has been chronically underfunded and undervalued, with national adaptation plans falling way short of what's needed. And that has to change, because adaptation, resilience building, collective preparedness together have the potential to appeal straightforwardly and viscerally to those for whom the climate challenge has seemed far away, a low priority, and those who've perhaps felt alienated from or even censured by some in the wider climate movement. That shift in emphasis, from seeming to lecture people on their carbon footprint to enabling them to protect themselves and their communities, has important potential to reduce polarization and strengthen shared concern and collaboration. And a shift in our framing, approaching people not as subjects or clients or consumers, but as citizens, as neighbors and agents, can in turn lead to a focus on more immediate outcomes, increasing our emphasis on community and household water saving, for example, or on local food growing, or on food sharing schemes. Now, some, like the recently established Climate Majority Project, are suggesting that what all this amounts to is a new approach, which they call green popularism, which puts reducing vulnerability and bracing for impacts front and center in climate concern. And they argue that it points to the need for the government to adopt a sixth mission to go with the 5 it already has. And that sixth mission would be to protect the public with mass public participation and mobilization against the growing climate threat. That is what strategic adaptation really is, and it's how to build resilience, both material and psychological. Because if we truly want climate concern to become popular, we need to demonstrate that the climate agenda is absolutely about directly helping and making a tangible difference to day-to-day life, to stand alongside people, not just in demanding protection, but seeking to enact elements of it. And in that context, of course, local government has a particularly important role to play. And so by this kind of building and organizing, we have the chance of countering the appeal of others who will no doubt rush to stoke less constructive anger against those in power. And finally, that brings me to hope. Hope that things can be better and a vision of how to achieve it. Not the kind of hope that's little more than a gamble on something that might happen or the false optimism of self-motivational memes on social media. Not the kind of hope that, in the words of Guardian journalist Jonathan Watts in an article just last week, is, in his words, the antidepressant that has been keeping us all comfortably numb when we have every right to be sad, worried, stirred to action, or just plain angry. But rather the kind of hope that gives us a profound sense of purpose. The kind of hope that Václav Havel had in mind when he famously said, "Hope is not the conviction that something will turn out well, but the certainty that something is worth doing no matter how it turns out." The kind of hope that the writer Rebecca Solnit describes as strong enough to propel you off the sofa, out of the door, and in her words, is an axe to break down doors with in an emergency. Because as she says, to hope is to give yourself to the future. And that commitment to the future is what makes the present inhabitable. I think that to give yourself to the future means being prepared to really see that different future that you want. And if we really see it, we can't help but act in ways that align with that future. So one example might mean acting in ways that tangibly foster the leaders of the future to which we aspire. Around the world, a growing number of inspirational young people are planting their flags in the ground. Young people currently denied not just the kind of leverage of being old enough to vote, but the likelihood of a livable future itself. Now, they give so many of us hope, but that can only be sustained if we give them something in return. The challenge in the struggle we all face together is not to accomplish as much as possible, it is rather to expand the very limits of the possible so we can accomplish what is necessary, indeed what is imperative. And I'd argue that it begins with giving power away to others, to our future leaders, by planting our flags in the ground alongside theirs so that everyone can see that we're on their side, by insisting on bringing young people into the rooms where the private diplomacy happens, onto the platforms on which we all speak, on handing over the microphones, by taking action alongside them when they put themselves on the line, being their defenders, literally, as well as verbally. Or to put it another way, by turning the words of intergenerational justice into deeds. And so, by way of a few words of conclusion, if the COVID-19 pandemic has taught us anything, it is that the seemingly unachievable can no longer be dismissed as such. And once we better understand that, and the resilience which comes from active, defiant, radical hope, we also better understand that being denied hope is a political and a moral failure. That the Labour government's counsel of despair and doom-laden warnings about being unable to afford meaningful change does bring with it a serious risk of further fracturing our society, further undermining trust in politics, and further fanning the flames of wildfires too. And that simmering resentment, cynicism, and hopelessness can so easily breed the condition in which populists thrive. Politics is indeed always about choices, and choosing not, for example, to tax the assets of the very wealthiest has its own implications. We can't hide from those truths or shy away from the consequences. We can, though, choose to see connections between the crises we face and in the causes and the solutions. we can choose to cultivate active radical hope, to build tomorrow today in our actions, and in so doing, accelerate the better future which we all deserve. Thank you.
Okay, thanks so much, Caroline. I'm just going to welcome on stage a whole panel of people who are going to discuss your ideas with you. Great, so from left to right, we have Professor Tahseen Jafry, who's come down all the way from Glasgow, thank you, to join us. Jon Alexander and Zamzam Ibrahim. So helpfully all sat in remote places, luckily. We're going to give you a bit of a break, and I'm going to ask everyone on stage to react to what you said, first of all. We're going to have a bit of a chat up on stage, and then we're going to welcome some questions from the audience. So if you can use this code on your phone, or you can go, if you can't quite get the angle right on your phone, if you type in menti.com and you type in the number there that you can see at the top, then you can access the Q&A and start typing in there what you want to ask. And I should find it here shortly. Right, so I'm going to go from left to right. Thank you, Caroline. That was really amazing. Tour de force, partly because you set up some challenging issues, but gave us a whole set of ways in which we could respond, both personally and institutionally, et cetera. I'd like to hear from each of you on the panel a bit of a reaction to that. And maybe something from your side. What kind of levers, either the ones Caroline mentioned or of your own, do you think can be most powerful in tackling both the climate crisis, but some of these other challenges as well?
Yeah. So do you want me to kick off?
Please.
Okay, so I got the task to kick off. Caroline, thank you very much for your talk. It was really deep and meaningful. And I think there's an aspect of your talk that came through very clearly for me, and that was this business about agency. You mentioned that quite a few times. And for me, I guess agency is so fundamentally rooted in our ability to be able to action and make progress on climate-related activities. Based in Glasgow, I know that Glasgow has benefited from its industrial past. We have the wonderful Glasgow City Council buildings and so on. But I also know that we are making a pathway towards transition through climate plans and strategies and frameworks and so on and so on. But the problem we face in Glasgow is this lack of trust and this significant lack of public participation. And that kind of like leads me to the reflections around agency in terms of how do we empower our citizens, particularly those who are marginalised in Glasgow, to be part of the solution, to be actively empowered and feel that they have a role to play and are the makeup of the solution. They're part of the equation going forward. So that's just, there were quite a few aspects, but I know the others will have lots to say as well. But I think that really struck me in terms of what came out of your speech and how that relates to also to resilience, and we'll pick up on that.
Yeah, we'll pick up on that in a moment. Okay, great. I'm going to allow everyone to say a few words. Quick word as well.
Okay. I guess, so I was one of the authors of the letter that you mentioned about the letter to government off the back of the riots and saying like, look what might be possible here. And I'm just recalling that moment as you were speaking, because if we remember this summer and the first round of riots, and then that Wednesday after the first round of riots, there was a list of 100 places that the far right were going to attack that Wednesday night that was circulating on social media, that got leaked on social media actually, refugee processing centres, Islamic cultural centres, this kind of thing. And what happened that night was that the public basically sort of spontaneously organised to protect those places, right? Like, if people remember that night, like in every single one of those places, as far as I'm aware, there were at least 150 and sometimes thousands of people who turned out to protect, often to an almost comical extent, right? There was that image where there were sort of 4 far-right guys, like, surrounded by police who were kind of protecting them because there was a massive street party going on that they weren't really invited to. and the pain in me, like the reason why that letter got written was a few of us were talking to each other, because the pain in us, kind of watching what the British people are capable of, and seeing who we really are, and then seeing the response from those in positions of power and influence, actually, frankly, the government being to say, no, don't worry, we're on it. Police and a firm hand has sorted this. Like my friends who are in these communities around the country who had organised, who had made that protection happen, it's not just that wasn't what happened, it was the people. It was the fact that different story, that we're on it, just was so disrespectful to the agency in communities around the country. And also the fact of what their speech could have been that wrote itself, right? Like imagine that morning, this is who we are, this is who we really are, this is what we're capable of. And let's now turn that energy to bear on climate, to bear on our health system, to bear on, like, and when we miss those opportunities, this sorry, your speech has made me like feel this all again, Caroline, damn you. But it was like, when we miss those opportunities, we're not just missing an opportunity, we're also shushing people, right? And that is so dangerous now. And I was just living that again. So that was the primary reaction.
Right, so he's still picking up on this idea of agency, the roles that individuals can play, but also the power.
But it's not, the thing is, it's not really the roles that individual can play. That's what I want to say. Like, there you go. Yeah. Over to you.
Good. Zamzam, over to you. Perfect.
I mean, I think for me, it was interesting because we were having a conversation. I was like, I don't think I'd disagree with anything Caroline says anyways. But actually, as you were talking, for me, and a lot of the work that I do is rooted in climate justice, right? And often I think when we use the word climate action, it dismisses actually working from a justice lens, looking at it from an economical, from a social, from a political lens, right? And what does it mean to work in that collective, right? Like why do communities mobilize and organize and come together and protect their own communities? It's when they feel invested. It's when they feel like that those are the communities that they want to build up and bridge, right? And often, almost always, a lot of the climate policies that we've seen come out of the UK doesn't look at like how we rebuild those communities. It doesn't look at how we build those collective spaces. And often we really ask ourselves, specifically for me, organising with climate activists and in these radical spaces as a young person as well, is that we always ask ourselves, like, can we really build like just climate policies out of a broken system? Like, can it really work? Like, can we generate like what the policies that we need, the action that we need through a system that has been set up, quite literally, like the policy system that we have set up was born out of like the empire, right? A colonial structure. So actually, like, are we just exacerbating other injustices by trying to solve this problem here, right? And we've seen that happen in many ways, where like a policy is passed, and where we're talking about investing in one form of infrastructure, but actually, what does that do to what are the other impacts on that local community? Like, what happens, right? And so actually, when we don't work through a justice model, like through a justice lens, we often exacerbate the problem further anyways, right? So it's really difficult to engage in talking about climate action when often, almost always, from a policy perspective, it's not rooted in justice, because rooting as justice would mean doing the work that literally John's talking about. It would be allowing people to have the power, right? It's completely displacing where power is today and reshifting that, and I think that's something we're, I think, holistically afraid to do, right? Because what will that mean? You know, what will that look like?
Okay, so so many different ideas there, and I don't know where to go. One is about power, and you spoke about power as well in your talk, and then you spoke about the justice lens. I'm going to pick out that one first, because we have you here from Scotland, which is a place that has actually tried it within the UK. So I want to hear to put climate justice more at the heart of what's going on, and I want to hear your thoughts about how Scotland's doing it.
How Scotland's doing it? Well, I guess we do have more thought processes into this business of just transition. In Scotland, we have the Just Transition Commission, so the Scottish Government are putting their weight behind that. I've explained already in Glasgow, with Glasgow City Council, really committed to the just transition cause through its policies, its strategies, its frameworks, its programming. And and within academia, there are quite a few of us that start working on just transition. So it's beginning to burgeon. However, what I would like to say is this idea of just transition is so confusing to many. It is very abstract, and it means different things depending on which discipline you come from, which sector you come from, and indeed which part of the world you come from. And this is the thing that worries me enormously, because as an expert and having worked on climate justice for many years and injustice, we know historically that those who have benefited from the emissions of the global north and those in the south are now experiencing the brunt of the climate crisis and extreme weather. My concern is that as we journey and move on to a just transition, it will be dependent on the extractives, the mining, the minerals and resources that will come, no doubt, from the global south to fuel our transition into clean, green and towards net zero. And this is where the business of history really worries me, is that if we don't learn lessons from the past, we'll be heading towards a rail crash. In fact, Caroline, you mentioned we are heading towards a train crash. If we don't really take stock and be honest and be transparent in our journey going forward to a fair and just transition that is meaningful for everyone, not just in the global north, but in the global south, but it's for everybody.
Okay, great. I'm trying to, I mean, I know you work a lot with community groups or citizen groups. And interested, like this challenge, I don't know, I see it maybe as a challenge, but interested in how we can square working with communities that might be more local, which is important for resilience, for adaptation, but also for this kind of collective ownership. But then also having in mind these other communities that might be quite far away from us, the global community. I'm interested to know how one might balance those. Jon.
I mean, I think, so one thing I see a little bit differently to the way Caroline framed it actually is that so you've framed it a bit more as there are sort of these two problems and there's a solution that can meet them both. I would argue, and it's a sort of, there are multiple crises, I would argue there's sort of one kind of meta crisis actually. And I think of that as a collapse of story, like as a collapse of an idea of the individual that we've been trapped in for 80 years or so. Like, and by the way, I began my career with 10 years in the advertising industry, so when I say this, don't like immediately think he's an anti-consumer. Like, I kind of am, but the story I believe is the consumer story. It's an idea that says that the right thing for us all to do is to pursue self-interest, that will add up to the collective interest, that is the kind of invisibly and kind of built into most of our systems. That is the idea. So what we have today is consumer democracy, where people's only agency is to choose between a fixed set of options every few years, and where we're assumed and even encouraged to make that choice on the basis of individual self-interest. We have, in context of climate, we've been stuck in this story of individual behaviour change as the greatest thing anyone can do, which is why I sort of picked up on that. When it's not, true agency is always collective. And you referred, I think, sort of hinting at some of my work in that idea of a shift from subjects and consumers as the story of the individual in society to citizen. But I think that's what we are living in, I think, is that collapse, that underlying collapse, and the rise of the, I would call them fascists, frankly, and the climate crisis are symptoms of that collapse. You can't solve those challenges from within a story that makes us all individuals, because they are symptoms of that crisis. Now, where you go from there, I think, is you're able to actually make this much more kind of everyday language and actually something that you can see communities and community power, not just as a sort of cute exception to the rule of misery that we're living in, but actually as a meaningful force. And so you start to be able to see that one of the most powerful things that's going on in the Global South right now is an organisation called the Global Alliance for Communities, that is Global South-led, community-led development organisations networking together to refuse to take philanthropic money except on the terms that they dictate, for example. But you can also see it in how, like, to jump forward into like what the positive application of that moment of misery on the riots might have looked like. Like, thought experiment, that mission, the mission for clean power in this country by 2030 could be being done in such an incredible way. Like, imagine if that was saying, like, let's all do this. Like, we're going to launch this mission in Lawrence Weston, the neighbourhood just outside of Bristol that is one of the most deprived neighbourhoods in the country, which has a community-owned wind turbine that is the tallest in England. We're going to launch it there, and we're going to say, everyone, do this. Like, we need community energy organisations everywhere. There are already 450 odd across England alone. Let's celebrate that. Let's get everyone involved. Let's put a citizens' assembly into the governance of the mission.
John, you're running so far ahead. Like, one question. We'll come back to the solutions towards the end. If we could just stick with communities just for the moment.
Communities are the solutions, is my short answer.
Okay, it was good, and to your longer answer. I just want to go, I will come back to this again, but I just collecting, so we've got these communities and some really great examples there in the Global South as well. But what I was trying to get to is quite tricky to, I think, to connect communities in the Global South and where we are in the Global North, effectively. And so you've also done a lot of work with all kinds of different communities, often in parallel, it seems like. You've got lots and lots of things you're doing at one time. So I'm curious about how you see enabling communities to move in some kind of common direction or to tackle a common problem.
Yeah, I mean, I think I've worked on grassroots level, on local, on national, on international, and I think, to me, the most impactful work comes from grassroots, comes from local community. And I think one of the things that we often fail to recognize is the intrinsic connection between some of the lived experiences in other parts of the world, right? So actually, and I think one of the things that the climate youth movement did incredibly well is mobilizing collectively with people who were angry about the same thing, right? And they were able to communicate in a way that simplified the climate conversation, right? The reality is that the climate conversation is completely presents us in a way that's inaccessible, right? In a way that is boring, as John literally just said, that we don't want to engage with, that we don't understand how it affects our day-to-day lives. Because the reality also is that there's a privilege to being even involved in that climate conversation, right? I remember I was recently held a workshop in Manchester after screening a film by Fenty Balogun called Can I Live? Which is a person of colour going through the climate space and becoming an activist. And it was local campaigners and local people from Manchester, and they were we don't have the privilege or the energy to talk about climate. We're doing campaigns around race, we're doing campaigns about this, right? And to them, they saw the climate crisis as a completely removed thing, right? And it's because that's how it's been presented to them. So when we started having this conversation about how climate justice is embedded and all the stuff that they were doing, it was all of a sudden a sense of agency in terms of well, how do we teach our children? How do we teach our community? And I think that's the powerful thing in the sense of what the climate movement did, the youth climate movement did, is that they educate each other. They were well, I know about this, so I'm gonna run a workshop and I'm gonna do teaching about this. And I think understanding knowledge is power, right? Understanding how do we ensure that we don't safeguard, not safeguard, but what's the word I'm looking for? Essentially, close the doors to the people to come after us, right? To ensure that we are allowing other people who are having those lived experiences to be able to advocate for themselves, right? We don't want to be the ones that are standing up in front of different spaces and policy spaces and talking about people's lived experiences that I've never lived, I've never walked, And I think that's incredibly important. And I think that's one thing youth movements really have done really well and have taught, and Caroline mentioned that, have taught the work, but actually the reality is that we also need to see the action, we need to see that walk, we need to see politicians walking the talk, and the reality is I've got a lot to say about our politicians, as I would, but the reality is, as long as the agenda, and I don't want to steer the conversation, but as long as our elected leaders don't represent us, they don't represent the communities, they're completely disconnected from community, then surely they shouldn't be in those positions, right? They shouldn't even be able to be talking about making decisions on a collective scale. I think that's the really dangerous thing that we've fallen into, where actually I can guarantee you most MPs can't really name the local communities, what's happening within their local vicinities, because they're so removed from it, right?
So I think you're picking up on what I think was your number 2, Caroline, which was sort of better, new kind of innovative ways of doing democracy as being a bit at the heart of climate action. And I really liked your example of the youth movement, the global youth movement as a community, because that shows that the kind of these we can build community not just in the way that you know, I immediately think about it, which is who lives locally to me, or who is, you know, who do I work with or whatever. But this kind of different interrelated global communities can be really powerful and can help connect what you were saying before, which is the kind of risks of action in one part of the world, sort of not respecting those in the other. I'm going to ask Caroline to come in now. You've had a bit of a break after your talk. A few things have come up here about people who are actively trying to undermine, and you spoke about power and power structures. You've been doing a brilliant job throughout your career, probably having to tackle some of those things directly. How do we manage those kind of active forces that really actually don't want any of this to happen?
I think by making alliances with others who feel the same as we do. I mean, I think there's going to be a theme throughout this whole evening, really, is that individuals on their own don't make the difference, that it is actually working together and finding those allies and making the noise louder, and making sure that those connections are visible and meaningful. So I think that's all we can do in a way, but make sure that it happens from the grassroots upwards. And that we are really challenging when it comes to those democratic structures. You know, it breaks my heart that we've still got a Labour government, in spite of all the amazing work that went on in Labour Party conferences to change the Labour Party position on voting reform. Keir Starmer's basically said, no, we're not going to do that. And I can only hope that he kind of changes his mind when he recognises that going for a second term probably means he won't be 20 points ahead in the opinion polls at that point. Because unless people feel that they've got a stake in the system, I mean, Zamzam, you spoke very, very powerfully about how much change can we make within the existing parameters of the system as we know it. And it becomes a chicken and egg if you're not careful. How do we change that system if we don't have power within it? Well, you know, one of the ways we could do that, hopefully, is by keeping this campaign going for a different kind of electoral system. And I know that's only one part of it, but at least if we had that, it could be the start of being able to re-engage people with that process and to have a confidence and trust in that process, which hopefully would then also feed through into other areas of people's lives as well.
Yeah, good. You were nodding to that.
Yeah, I was going to, if I could just build on the conversation. I think we have an opportunity here to build alliances across the globe. This conversation, because the climate is changing so much, this conversation shouldn't really be about global north and global south. And I'm wondering whether we should use this as an opportunity to shift the narrative around people who are really affected by extreme weather and climate. It's not just, we understand historically from climate injustice that it's those in the global south that suffer the most, but the experiences of those in the north who have also not contributed very much, very little to carbon emissions, are feeling the brunt in the north as well. So we have an opportunity to connect communities right across the planet and across different themes. And I think the mental health crisis is one of the most burgeoning, significant crises that is ahead of us, and yet we speak very little about it. And the research that we've conducted in countries such as Malawi, our data tells us that people, particularly women, are actually on the brink of committing suicide because they just can't cope. And these are really significant findings, and I'm wondering to what extent something like that is actually playing out in other countries. And we really should take stock of some of these important conversations that are happening and put them to the forefront and get politicians and others to recognise if we don't take action, then we have severe consequences for people and planet.
Everyone's getting excited now. I can see that panelist leaning forward. John, you want to say something?
I suppose it's just in this thing of like the idea that I think there's a risk of reinforcing the idea that the power is in Westminster rather than people stepping into the power they have. And just to illustrate what I'm saying, there's an organisation that I've become very close to and a community that I've become very close to in Grimsby, I'll try and keep this very short, sorry. Get very excited. But in Grimsby, there's this organisation called East Marsh United, which is arguably started on the roughest street in the roughest neighbourhood in one of the roughest towns in the country, actually, like on the measures that are taken to show these things. started as a litter pick, and 6 months on they had a fortnightly magazine called The Proud East Martian and an arts festival called The Sun and Moon that's happened ever since. A couple of years on, they ran a £500,000 community share offer, which was enough in Grimsby to buy 10 houses, refit them using good local jobs, and then let them out as a social landlord to provide a sustainable revenue stream for the rest of the organisation. What they've then gone on to do is they're now crowdsourcing, like with the citizens of the East Marsh, what they're calling the East Marsh Charter, inspired by the Chartists, right? Like, and no one's helping these guys do this, really. Like, there's actually a bit of help from Grimsby Town Football Club, which is quite a fun story, the idea of a football club as an anchor institution. But they're not waiting, they're not saying, because for the people of the East Marsh, it hasn't arguably mattered which party's been in power, and PR isn't like.
But it's not either or, is it?
I do think building from outside is different. If you're going to scale up some of the things that you're talking about, which I have huge, excitement about, and I absolutely agree with you that it's absolutely right that people don't sit around waiting for some kind of, Deus Ex Machina to come down to sort things out. But nonetheless, at a time when we've got 5 years left of a carbon budget, it feels to me as if we could actually get elected people who would do more of what we want them to do and to open more of those doors, that would be a bloody good thing. And that doesn't cut across what you're saying about the community resilience. But it does question where you start with that. Like, do you start, because my argument is that you start by building the power in the communities.
I think you do, but I don't know why you have to choose.
I think you have to, because I think what happens if you start...
Because I think that leads to that. I think elected leaders will only pay attention when communities are organising, right? It's the reality of, like, when I find myself like lobbying and campaigning to make sure that MPs are doing what they said they were going to do, it's only when they know that we have numbers behind us, right? And so, like, there's power in that collective power, and I think that's essential ways when you mobilise and educate a community on how is the crisis affecting them. The politicians are more likely to listen up, right? It's not necessarily about making them care, because I think a lot of them don't really care. It's about embarrassing them to the point that they have to act. I think that's the reality, right?
Good. I think that's a good action to take, everyone. Go embarrass somebody. Okay, we're going to move on to questions now. So a lot of people have managed to use the question function. I can tell that because I have a whole list of questions in front of me. It's a long list. We're not going to be here until we finish them all. But people have helpfully voted to indicate which ones they're most interested in. So since we're talking about proportional representation, I'm not going to start by choosing the top one, though. So that's not very good example. Because I really like this question, which is, imagine yourself speaking in Madison Square at a Trump rally. Lucky you, all of you. How would you bring the audience alongside?
That's a really interesting
Anyone
question.
want to take that, or should we park that and I'll ask another question?
I can come in with
All
a
right,
thought.
you're keen to be
I'm
there.
bouncy as hell. Like, so it's a slightly lateral, as a true politician, lateral answer. But I would say, actually, the thing I would talk about would be Kamala's rally. I don't know if people saw the thing where there was a heckle from the audience, and she said, "Oh, you guys are at the wrong rally. You wanted to be at the one down the street, the smaller one down the street, which was the Trump rally." And I think the thing I would do differently is that, like, my thought experiment in this is, like, imagine if what she'd said was, come on up here, like, we want to hear from you. Like, what are you frightened of? Come meet me.
I don't think she wanted to do that.
I understand that, and maybe they might have been frisked on the way, let's be clear. But, like, but bridging that so that you actually can say, like, we're going to rise above this, that for me would be the intervention.
Okay, good. Good. You can keep thinking if anyone wants to throw in their Trump rally comment later, then we can come back to that. We're speaking quite a lot about marginalised communities and people on the front line of climate impacts. So if we can, people in the audience are interested in that area, how can the climate change solutions themselves be reimagined to bring those communities in better, do you think? I mean, you mentioned adaptation in your talk.
I think a huge amount rests on reframing what we mean by adaptation. Adaptation at the moment gets to be thought of, I think, as a very kind of technical thing. You know, you're going to put homes on stilts so they don't get flooded or something. Whereas I think strategic adaptation is something that's much, much broader than that and does give us the opportunity to be absolutely with the warp and weft of people's lives in the way that Zamzam and others were describing in terms of making that link between what is the challenges you're facing on a really daily basis got to do with climate. And I think through some of the work on having a much broader definition of adaptation gives people a way into that.
if I can
go for
just
it.
build on that. There are some fundamental aspects to this, and I think this is about inclusivity, this is about voice, this is about representation, and this is about participation. And when it comes to looking at climate adaptation frameworks, we know, as you said, Caroline, in your speech, that it's not been supported as much as the mitigation side of things. And my understanding is because, generally speaking, people, citizens, individuals, communities are finding it challenging and difficult to actually put forward what their adaptation needs are and how to structure that conversation and package it up in a way that, I hate to use this word attractive, and it shouldn't be attractive, but it does require resources to underpin and support adaptation plans. And therein lies the other problem is in terms of climate just financing. Unless we get that head on, it will be very difficult to implement many of these more innovative things unless the money is not on the table to get us there. But I'm glad to say that Glasgow City Council have just, and ourselves are working towards looking at what climate just financing means for a city council in terms of an urban landscapes. This is kind of like quite new and novel, but we understand that the finance that's supposedly out there, a meagre 1 to 3% of that actually reaches those who need that financial support the most. So it's quite a complicated conundrum of things, but in terms of getting individuals involved, it's looking at that broad picture of how it all fits together, hangs together, and can be supported and implemented, and solutions that are sustainable in the short, medium, and long term, I think, is what we need.
Okay, so a bit more challenge there also in squaring lots of challenges.
There's huge amounts of challenges out there, but it's that big picture thing, and visioning what the future looks like is what we need to be homing in on. And that relates onto how you educate and create that awareness amongst everyone in society. It's like adopting a whole of society approach, which is a phrase that I use quite often, a whole of society approach that takes everybody with us on this journey. And it's not the sustainable development goal to leave no one behind, but I'm changing that to say we have to take everybody with us on this journey.
Okay, good. And with that in mind, someone has a practical question. So what if there are people in the audience or listening who want to get involved with shaping the future of climate action or climate policy, or want to shape the whole future of it? What should they do? Words of advice. Zamzam, I'm going to ask you first.
I just wanted to, can I go back
yeah,
as well?
absolutely.
Okay, so, because I wanted to, oh, my brain's just doing that. So many things I want to say. If I start rapping, please apologize.
Do it.
Don't tempt me. I think the really important thing that we need to understand is that when we talk about this building this collective movement, right? When we talk about movement building, when we talk about systems of implementing systems of change, right? It involves people at its very root, right? But it also means meeting people where they are, right? And I think often that's something we very much forget. Like England is one of the richest nations. It is one of the most highly educated by population. There are so many things, there is no reason that a death like Ella Deborah should be happening in this country, right? So actually, often, I advocate and try to explain, how climate justice and the inequalities that happen in other parts of the world, right? We talk about the Global South quite often. We do a lot of work in Somalia more specifically, right? But actually, if you don't care about the Global South, right? Let's just take it as a base level. If we're not going to care about the Global South, right? Are you going to care about your next door neighbor? Right? We're going to care about actually the communities that we live in, that we're growing in, that we're raising our children in, right? I think that's incredibly important, because I think when Caroline talks about adaptation plan, it is building that future. It is building a future for us to be able to live in, right? And so when I say meeting communities where they're at, it's the reality is, if I was at a Trump rally, right, I would know not to talk about certain things, but actually the reality is that I genuinely believe that we need to bring everybody as a part of this movement, right? And so as much as I don't want to be talking to our far right piece of shit, respectfully, right?
Not that respectful.
Right, disrespectfully. But the reality is, right, that if we're going to build, if I'm really saying I want to build a collective movement, right, then it means bringing everybody on board, right? And honestly, the reality is a lot of people that find themselves on this like spectrum of hate are often because they were misinformed, right? They're angry and disappointed and let down, right? By the very systems that are effing us over too, right? So the reality is that like we find ourselves in these splinters of systems of injustice, right? And often the narrative that's told, the story that is told, right, is that like they are the problem, right? And all of us are like become and like coming back to like that narrative of storytelling, right? Like all of us need to understand that like nobody is the problem. Like we are the collective solution. And so I think the reality is that like when we talk about, so just coming back to the question that essentially you asked, right? Is that like we can't talk about adaptation. We can't talk about like what does our collective community need when we're not a collective, we're not a community, we're not working in that.
And if I, like, just to come into this thing of what do you do, and I'm keen to lean into this sort of slight tension around PR and stuff. I think it's like if that's where the energy is, we should face that. Like my argument would be that the answer to that question is get involved. Like choose whether it's your local community, your professional community, or like some community, and get stuck in. Find the others and figure out what to do together and start as building that collective agency. And the reason I do think it starts there is because I worry that we're so that it's very easy to be for something. And to sign up to a petition for something, and my worry is that, like, if we let that be the headline, or even the first line, or actually even a really prominent line, rather than just something that pops up in the flow of the conversation, then we're actually encouraging people to see being for something as the most significant thing they can do, when actually finding one another, meeting one another, doing stuff together, doing life together is the most significant thing, particularly, and maybe we should bring this in a little bit, like, if it does all fall apart, right? Like, if we, like, people, we need each other. And forming those communities, the headline of that work of forming community, finding one another, getting involved, is so we can redesign the systems and evolve them. Yeah. But the subtext is we may well need each other.
Absolutely, we are bloody well going to need one another, and that's exactly why things like community food growing and food sharing and all of that, to me, is climate adaptation in one way. I'm not suggesting that's the headline that you take out to communities when you're going to sit alongside and talk with them, but that's essentially what it is. Absolutely. But if I can just come back a second to the Trump point, because I've just been mulling over that one. And
figure it out now.
And you're ready now. We'll just be taking you to the rally around the corner then.
Yeah. Well, no, I was just thinking about Brexit, as you do, and how, in a sense, you know, that was our Trump moment.
We almost got there.
But what I did after Brexit was to set up this little group called Dear Leavers, and we went out to those communities that had most overtly and in most majorities voted to leave. Places like Dagenham and Dudley and Isle of Wight. And we sat with them and we listened, and we didn't even say, why did you vote Brexit? We said, what is it that you really love about your community? What is it you don't love so much about your community? And through that conversation, you find all kinds of common ground, and you find some real themes. And one of the big themes that came out, to take this whole conversation full circle, was about people's sense of powerlessness.
Yeah. Absolutely.
And so I suppose with Jon, I don't know if we're just kind of
ferociously
arguing for this, just, but
are.
actually agreeing. Because I absolutely get that agency has to be built bottom up, and I absolutely get that a more effective way for politicians to listen will be if you've got a mobilized community that is very clear about what it wants. But I still don't want to go away from the fact that I don't see why that can't be done in tandem with, because there is an urgency about all of this. There is, there really is, and scaling up some of these things through having a more enabling policy framework that will put the money on the table for some of that just transition, for example, just feels to me, why wouldn't you do that at the same time? So I just kind of feel we're kind of having an argument for the sake of it, but that's politics.
Okay, good. No, I think that whole thing about listening to people and meeting people where they're at and really understanding what those issues are and finding common ground is what will take us forward collectively. I totally agree. So some really interesting questions here. We've only got a few more more minutes, but some really interesting questions here. Can't believe I'm going to throw this in just before we finish. About these concepts, you spoke a little bit to concepts that could be bracketed as degrowth or maybe not anti-capitalism, but alternatives, to growth. You
I'm happy anti-capitalism, all for
okay.
it.
and climate justice. And some of these concepts can be really helpful in binding what we're trying to do, but to other people, and we spoke about listening to other people's perspectives, they might be perceived as too radical or might be frightening. Discuss. In 30 seconds each.
So capitalism.
Where do we go?
How do we do that combination of meeting people where they're at, but also taking some quite complex and to some people quite radical concepts, bringing those to the table?
I keep doing this, so shut me if someone else wants to.
Go ahead.
Okay, so I just want to be clear that I'm not doing the white man thing, right?
Sorry, I'll speak.
Thanks, Steve. There is I think there's I would argue that talking about anti-capitalism, degrowth, post-capitalism actually isn't that helpful because you're still kind of talking about the thing that you're saying you're not. I think in the linguistic sense, we need more positive conversations, not necessarily in the kind of vision sense, but in the linguistic sense.
Correct.
And I think concepts like resilience are super important. And if you could, and I think that conversation is starting in corporate world. I spend a bit of my time in that world. That conversation is starting because they are seeing massive hits to bottom lines when these shocks happen. And so a conversation about resilience is actually a really radical one because it takes you to a place where you're actually, we don't just want efficiency, we need redundancy in our systems, as in space for them to fail and recover. We need to learn more from nature because nature is resilient. But it's because you're talking about resilience in quite a hard-nosed way, not sort of setting yourself up as reactionary in some sense. So that would be my take.
That's a really helpful way of looking at it, and your PR background or whatever, advertising background, really helpful to take that time.
So I've got 10 seconds or 15 seconds.
Oh no, I'm meant to pay attention to that. You don't have to worry.
No, but the way I would look at it, and in reflection to what Caroline, your lecture was about, hope. This is, I would see it as a way of looking at opportunity, because we have to put ourselves out there in terms of what are the benefits to be gained for humankind and for planet all round. So we need to look at opportunity and the solutions that are going to help us to get there. And I think it's a purposeful way to navigate our way around this conversation because we need that end goal at some point. These are the things that are going to repair or fix or alternatives that will help everyone to progress in the years to come.
Right, well, that was actually brilliant, bringing it back to hope, but also I think a right way to kind of speak to lots of different people, that kind of opportunity and hope.
Exactly.
I'm going to go to Caroline next and then Zamzam. You're going to have the last word, so.
So me next.
Yeah.
I can't even remember what your question was, but
just say whatever you want to say.
I would like to take it back to stories because I agree very much with what Jon said about the stories, and I talked a little bit about this kind of neoliberal story that we've all had, telling us that we are all in competition with one another, and actually, if we could think of that differently, then I think it opens up all sorts of possibilities. And I suppose I wanted to take it very briefly into the realm of the arts, which I touched on. Just very briefly in what I said, but it feels to me as if the arts in its broadest sense and culture have a real role in reminding us that we are much more than these kind of narrow economic units that sometimes we get described as, and that we can imagine different worlds. And in a sense, I think the failure of politics has been a failure of imagination. And maybe if politicians were all sat down with a bit more poetry or taken to a few more art galleries, then maybe the policies we'd end up might be a bit different. But it feels to me as if in this kind of community approach that we're kind of talking about going forward, I just want to make a plea that we really build in the arts as part of that as well, because I think they've got an incredibly important role in terms of helping us tell those other stories.
Yeah, brilliant, thanks. And Zamzam, you can now talk about any of the things that anyone has done.
Capitalism.
Yeah,
because I think it goes back to the first point I made, right? In terms of where power is held, and the reality is that as long as we have systems that are built off exploitation, that are built off of prioritizing money wealth over people, over any living thing, like we're gonna be stuck in that systems of deprivation, right? And I think the reality is that like, and we can do both, right? We can do climate action, but also by recognizing that a lot of our climate action isn't enough, right? But we need to be able to recognize it in order to do that work. But I think also one of the things I think for me, and it comes back to like a powerful quote by Malcolm X, is that like if you stab me 9 inches and you pull out the knife 6 inches, then you haven't solved the problem. If you pull out all the way, you still haven't solved the problem. Solving the problem is in healing, right? And like, how do we heal our communities? It's by investing, it's by building by collective communities, and by doing the actual work. Because I think the reality is that like, by recognizing that like, there's a crooked system, right? But we're gonna dilly-dally around it. It's pretending like the problem isn't that. And I think that's incredibly important for us to recognize, to be able to move forward, to be able to solve the issues that we find ourselves. Because the reality is, the first thing I wrote down when you started speaking was unprecedented times. I don't know how long we've been in unprecedented times, right? It has literally felt like and I'm gonna swear again, like years of like a global clusterfuck, right? Like it's just been something after something after something. We're quite literally like, can it get any worse? Like I'm asking myself, like, how did these systems of oppression make it even worse for working class communities? And then we see it, and then I'm like, wow, okay. People are quite literally dying and being impacted by not being able to eat, by not being able to heat their houses, right? Like, these are terrifying things and linked to climate justice, right? So I think it's just incredibly important for us to really come back to like what it means to essentially unfuck ourselves and the systems and rebuild systems of justice that are able to serve our communities, serve our collectives, and essentially do that through our elected leaders, like hold them accountable. So everybody become an activist.
Brilliant, perfect. Well, that was a great way to Thank you all for your fantastic contributions, and I think I could see with each of you, we could spend hours and hours talking about all of these things, and there were like over 75 questions here. So if I didn't ask your question, it's not because I didn't like it. Thank you so much for sharing all of your ideas with us, and hopefully inspiring people here to think about how they can take action, and galvanizing some people or strengthening them to find hope in the things that they're trying to do in these maybe continuingly unprecedented times. In terms of housekeeping, there are some refreshments downstairs, so please finish them. You can go downstairs through either of the side when we're finished there. If I could ask you kindly, my colleagues may send you a message after this to ask you to give us feedback. Please do that, and that can help us inform what we do with this information, who we help bring to the stage or connect you with in the future. I think my microphone's just been turned off, which means it's time to finish. Thank you again for all coming. Thank you again to our speakers, and please enjoy the rest of the evening.
Hold on. I never think of that.